I can still hear the sound of metal against cloth, that steady rhythm of a rifle being cleaned. It's funny how something so mechanical can feel almost sacred. In those moments, sitting alone in the dim light of the armory, I wasn't a soldier or a woman or a veteran. I was simply a pair of steady hands preparing for a duty that most people would never understand. To them, I was the quiet one, the woman who spent too much time in the corner polishing her rifle. They saw calluses on my palms, but never the years behind them. They joked that I must have been assigned to cleaning duty because I couldn't shoot straight. Maybe I let them believe it. Sometimes silence is easier than explanation. The truth is, silence was my armor. It kept me focused when chaos broke around me. It kept me alive when the line between breathing and dying was measured in heartbeats. There's a kind of peace that comes with stillness. The kind you can only find when you're lying face down in the dirt, watching through a scope, waiting for the wind to die. I remember the longest wait of my life, almost 3 hours without moving more than a breath. The sun shifted, the air thinned, and the wind whispered across 2.5 kilometers of distance. That day my shot traveled 2,600 meters before finding its mark, twice the range of any standard training. A bullet in flight for nearly 3 seconds can carry a lifetime inside it. No one clapped, no one cheered, they didn't even know my name, but I knew what it meant. I knew that sometimes the quietest moments hold the loudest echoes. People think strength is about noise, about command, about the sound of power. But the strongest people I've known carried their battles in silence. The ones who endured loss, who came home and still found a way to stand tall. They never needed applause, they just needed purpose. Now that I'm retired, people ask if I miss it. The uniform, the mission, the weight of the rifle in my hands, sometimes I do. But what I miss most is the stillness before the shot, the space between fear and focus where everything slows and the world holds its breath. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to live in that silence, to find strength and patience, stay with me. This isn't just a war story. It's a story about the people who serve quietly, the ones who fight battles you'll never read about, and the women who prove that courage isn't measured in noise. If this story speaks to you, like the video, subscribe to Military Revenge and share it with someone who believes in the quiet kind of strength, because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one ever sees. Morning came early at Camp Redwood, the kind of morning that didn't care whether you'd slept or not. The air was already heavy with the scent of oil, dust, and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. The sound of boots on concrete echoed across the yard like a slow heartbeat. For most soldiers, it was routine. For me, it was another day pretending that routine was enough. I walked into the armory before the sun even cracked the horizon. My hands knew the motion by heart. Racks of rifles lined the walls, each one tagged, cleaned, recorded. I had been assigned to maintenance detail for 6 weeks straight. Some called it punishment duty. Others said it was where the army sent people they didn't know what to do with. Either way, I didn't argue. I liked the quiet. The rifles were never judged. The younger soldiers drifted in one by one, still half asleep, joking about the weekend or complaining about drills. I kept my eyes on the weapon in front of me, a standard M4 carbine, not glamorous, not personal, just another piece of metal that had seen more action than most of the people cleaning it. Behind me, I heard laughter. A group of new recruits had spotted me. They were all muscle and swagger, the kind of soldiers who believed loudness was proof of competence. One of them nudged the other and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Hey, don't forget to ask Torres how she manages to shine the barrels better than anyone. Maybe she was born for housekeeping." I didn't look up. My hand stayed steady, cotton patch moving in slow, practiced circles. The laughter rippled behind me, sharp and careless. Another voice added, "They say she washed out of sniper school. Guess she found her true calling with the cleaning supplies." It wasn't the first time, it wouldn't be the last. I'd learned a long time ago that silence disarms people faster than anger. Anger gives them a target. Silence leaves them uneasy. Inside, though, I felt that old heat rise. The same one I used to feel years ago in Afghanistan when someone doubted whether I could keep up on a ruck march or pull my own weight in the field. They didn't know that every word they threw at me just sharpened the edge of my focus. I finished cleaning the carbine, reassembled it, and placed it neatly back in the rack. One of the recruits muttered something under his breath about old dogs and easy jobs. I turned, not fast, not slow, just enough for him to see my face. He tried to hold my gaze but looked away first. Funny how confidence collapses when someone refuses to play along. Later that morning, the platoon gathered outside the armory for formation. The sun had climbed high enough to bleach the world into hard edges. Sergeant Whitman called roll, his voice clipped, efficient, detached. When he reached my name, he paused just a fraction longer than the others. Torres, he said, eyes scanning the clipboard. Still on maintenance detail. Yes, Sergeant. He nodded. Good, we need someone reliable there. It might have sounded like praise, but it wasn't. In military code, reliable often meant invisible, the kind of person you could count on not to make noise. As we were dismissed, I caught the smirk of another soldier, Private Keener. Reliable, he whispered to his buddy. Guess that's what they call it when you can't hit a target. I wanted to tell him that reliability was the reason people made it home alive, that it meant showing up day after day, even when no one saw the value in what you did. But words were wasted on people still learning the difference between service and show. That afternoon, while the others trained on the range, I stayed behind to inventory the storage room. Boxes of ammo, maintenance kits, cleaning rods. The air was thick and dry. The hum of the overhead lights blending with my own heartbeat. I counted, logged, and double-checked. Every number mattered. Precision wasn't a skill for me, it was a survival instinct. There's something almost meditative about routine. You fall into rhythm, and for a moment, the noise of the world fades. But that peace never lasts long, not in a place where everyone measures worth by volume and muscle. By evening, word had spread that Lieutenant Pierce was planning a marksmanship assessment. It was a big deal for the younger ones, a chance to prove themselves. The chatter filled the mess hall. Who would shoot best? Who would choke? My name never came up. Why would it? The woman who cleaned rifles wasn't part of their world. I sat alone at the end of the table, pushing cold potatoes around my tray. A conversation at the far end caught my ear. Bet she's never even fired that Barrett she babysits all day, someone laughed. Probably thinks recoil is a yoga pose. It stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were too young to understand what restraint costs. There was a time when I might have corrected them. Might have told them that recoil isn't what you feel in your shoulder, it's what you carry in your bones afterward. The echo of every shot you wish you didn't have to take. I stood, dumped my tray, and walked out into the night. The desert stretched beyond the wire, silent and endless. Stars blinked overhead, cold and distant. I leaned against the railing and let the dry wind hit my face. That was when I remembered my father's voice. He used to say that the measure of a marksman wasn't in how many targets they hit, but in how long they could wait before they fired. Patience, he'd tell me, separates the hunter from the hopeful. Back then, I didn't understand. Now, standing there in the dark, I finally did. The following week blurred into repetition, maintenance, reports, briefings. A kind of invisible grind that numbs the edges of time. Then one morning, the armory door swung open, and Sergeant Whitman stepped in. Torres, he said, you're assigned to the test range this afternoon. Range control needs extra hands. I nodded. Orders were orders, but when he left, I couldn't help the faint smile that crept in. The range wasn't just a place to shoot. It was a place where silence could finally speak. By noon, the sun was high and merciless. Dust shimmered across the distance like a mirage. The range smelled of gunpowder and burnt brass. Targets lined the horizon, white circles against endless tan. The other soldiers were already there, loud and restless, adjusting scopes, cracking jokes, betting on scores. Lieutenant Pierce stood by the observation hut, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting everything and revealing nothing. All right, folks, he called out. We'll start at 600 meters, move to 8, then 1200. Show me what you've got. One by one, they took turns. Shots cracked through the air, echoing off the distant hills. Some hit close, some missed by miles. Each round came with a chorus of cheers or groans. When my turn came, Pierce barely looked up. Torres, you know the drill. Don't take all day. I nodded, adjusted the strap of my cap, and lay down behind the M2010 rifle. The dirt was hot beneath me. I inhaled, exhaled, let the world narrow into the crosshairs. The wind was shifting right to left, about 9 kilometers per hour. Heat shimmer bent the air like liquid. I adjusted 0.5 mil up, 1 mil left. Someone snickered behind me. Don't forget to wipe it down when you're done. I ignored it. Through the scope, the target was a pale dot on the edge of clarity. I watched it breathe in the mirage, waited for the gust to steady, then I squeezed. The crack split the air, and a heartbeat later, the spotter called out impact, center mass. The chatter stopped. I cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again. Another impact, then a third, 3 rounds, 3 hits, all within 20 centimeters of the center. No one spoke for a full 5 seconds. Then someone muttered. Lucky grouping. Pierce looked at me over his sunglasses. You trained for that somewhere, Torres? I met his gaze. Just got lucky, sir. He studied me a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. All right, pack it up. As I stood, I caught a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, maybe even respect, but it passed quickly. I knew better than to expect acknowledgement. In the military, silence has its own hierarchy. That night, as I sat cleaning the rifle under the same dim light as always, I could still feel the recoil in my shoulder. Not from the shot itself, but from holding back the truth of who I was. It's strange how people decide who you are before you even speak. They see what's convenient for them to see. They call it judgment. I call it blindness. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the desert wind crawling along my skin, and hear the echo of that single word from the spotter's call, impact. It reminds me that even when no one's watching, precision still matters. If you've ever been underestimated, you know what that silence feels like, the weight of it, the way it pushes you to prove something, not to others, but to yourself. And maybe that's what kept me there, polishing steel in the shadows. Because deep down, I knew the day would come when silence wouldn't be enough. The next morning, the barracks buzzed with the low thrum of gossip. No one said it to my face, but I could feel the whispers brush past me like static. 3 perfect shots were too neat to ignore. A few said it was luck. Some said the wind must have been on my side. Soldiers hate unexplained things. They need their world to make sense. A woman with quiet hands landing tight groups at 1,200 meters didn't fit the script. Private Keener was the first to speak up in the mess hall. He leaned across the table and said, "You got a steady hand, Torres. Maybe you missed your calling in the carnival shooting booths." The table erupted in laughter. I just smiled faintly, stirring the last of my oatmeal. It was never worth feeding their fire. But Lieutenant Pierce was watching. I caught his eyes across the room, that same unreadable expression behind mirrored lenses. He looked away first this time. That told me more than any compliment could. After breakfast, the squad was assigned to field prep for an upcoming exercise. We loaded gear, checked comms, and cleaned vehicles. It was the kind of repetitive work that fills the hours between real moments. The desert heat pressed down like a weight, thick with the smell of diesel and dust. Sweat stung my eyes as I hauled ammo crates to the Humvee. Keener walked by and smirked. "Careful, Torres. Those boxes might be heavier than a rifle." I pretended not to hear. But later, when he tripped over a cable and dropped an entire crate of rounds into the sand, I helped him pick them up one by one. He looked embarrassed. I didn't say a word. That night, while the others gathered in the rec room to watch some mindless show, I went back to the armory. The building felt different after hours, quieter, almost reverent. The hum of the air vents and the faint click of metal on metal were the only sounds left. I unlocked the storage cage and pulled out the Barrett M107. The rifle was longer than my arm span, heavy but balanced like something alive. I set it on the table and ran my hand along the barrel. Every scratch on its surface had a story, every dent a memory of force. To most, it was a weapon. To me, it was a conversation partner. It never asked for words. Only precision. I started my ritual cleaning, inspecting, adjusting. A thin film of oil caught the light and turned silver. My breath slowed, my mind emptied. I thought of all the times I had waited behind a scope, counting heartbeats, measuring the distance between life and death. It had been years, but the rhythm was still there, patient and sharp. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. The smell of cigarette smoke told me who it was. Pierce stepped in, closing the door softly. "You come here every night." I nodded, just keeping things ready. He studied me for a moment. "That Barrett isn't on your issue list." "I logged the maintenance," I said. "Same as always." He exhaled slowly, tapping ash into a small metal tray. "You shot well yesterday. Have you ever done any advanced marksmanship training?" I looked up at him. "I've had some." He tilted his head, curious. "Where?" "Different places, a long time ago." He gave a quiet laugh. "You talk like a ghost story." "Maybe that's all I am to some people," I said. He nodded once and left without another word. The door shut behind him, leaving the scent of smoke and questions hanging in the air. The next few days, tension built like pressure in a sealed chamber. I could feel it in how the others looked at me, how their jokes lost humor and turned into watchful silence. People don't like mysteries in close quarters. They either try to solve them or destroy them. During weapons inspection, Whitman stopped by my bench, Torres. Lieutenant says you're cleared for range support again tomorrow. Seems he wants another look at your technique. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Inside, my pulse quickened. I didn't want attention, not yet, but orders were orders. The following day, the wind was sharp, cutting across the range at an angle that made every shot a gamble. Targets were set farther out than before at 1,400 meters. The rest of the unit lined up, some eager, some uneasy. Pierce stood near the observation post. We're testing consistency today, 3 rounds each, closest grouping wins. Keener went first. His first shot hit low right. The next 2 were wide. He cursed under his breath and muttered about the wind. The others fared no better. When my turn came, I adjusted the bipod, settled the rifle into my shoulder and breathed out. The wind was flickering between gusts. I could feel it through the sand against my cheek. I waited. 15 seconds, 20, then it steadied just enough. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, a deep thunder that rolled across the desert. The spotter called out, hit. 2 inches off center. I reloaded. Another breath, another shot. Impact 1 inch right. The third shot came smoother than a heartbeat. Impact dead center. For a second the world stood still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then someone clapped once sarcastically, but the noise died fast. Pierce walked over, looked through the scope himself, then back at me. Not bad for maintenance duty. Thank you, sir. He nodded slowly. Report to my office after chow. Back at the barracks, I felt their eyes follow me. They whispered again, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was uneasy. Respect always starts as confusion. In Pierce's office, the blinds were half drawn, stripes of light cutting across the desk. He motioned for me to sit. I pulled your file, he said. It's thin, too thin for someone who shoots like that. Some of my records are classified, I said. That's what it says. But I can't figure why a soldier with your background ends up on maintenance. I didn't answer. He leaned forward. Have you ever heard the phrase hiding in plain sight? I met his gaze. Sometimes that's the safest place to be. He watched me for a long time before nodding. Fine, but if you're staying quiet for the right reasons, I need to know I can trust you. We've got an evaluation coming up with a command. I want you on the test team, quietly. I hesitated. You sure the others will be fine with that? They'll get over it. That night, I sat on my bunk staring at the ceiling. I could hear laughter in the hallway, boots scuffing against tile, the hum of the base generator outside. The world went on as if nothing had changed, but I could feel it. The shift, the weight of being seen again after so long in the background. It's strange how exposure feels more dangerous than combat. A few days later, Pierce called me to the hangar where the test team was prepping for evaluation. The mission was simple: demonstrate precision under stress at varying distances. But nothing is ever simple when pride is involved. When I walked in, Keener's face darkened. So this is the secret weapon, he muttered. Didn't know we were letting janitors join the show. I ignored him and checked my gear. Rangefinder, data card, scope calibrated. The wind had picked up again. The sky washed pale with heat. The team lined up. Targets staggered between 800 and 2,000 meters. Pierce raised his hand. On my mark, fire when ready. One by one the rifles cracked. Dust plumes rose. The spotters shouted coordinates. Then my turn came. At 2,000 meters, the target was barely more than a whisper in the distance. I measured wind drift, noted mirage flow. My breath slowed to match the beat of my pulse. Then the world disappeared except for that single point. Trigger press, recoil, silence. Impact, the spotter called. Left edge. I adjusted half a click right and fired again. Center mass. Pierce smiled faintly. Good shooting, Sergeant. He said it casually, but the word slipped out, Sergeant. My real rank from before everything got buried under reassignments. He knew now. After the evaluation, the team packed up in silence. Keener avoided my eyes. The rest kept their distance. By the time I got back to the armory, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rust. I cleaned the rifle slowly, tracing every line of its frame. The metal still held the warmth of the day. I thought about the path that had led me here, every shot fired, every moment spent in stillness, every name I couldn't say. There's a cost to being underestimated. It eats at you quietly until you either break or harden into something unshakable. I chose the latter. That night, as lights flickered out across the base, I sat by the window watching the stars rise over the wire, somewhere out there. The world believed soldiers like me didn't exist. Women who carried ghosts, precision, and silence in equal measure. But we do exist, we're just harder to spot. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. The next chapter of my story didn't begin with glory. It began with a request, Pierce knocking softly on my door saying, "There's something coming, a mission, and we need your eyes on it." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the photo taped beside my bunk, my father standing next to a younger version of me, both of us holding rifles almost too big for our frames. His handwriting on the back read, "Patience is power." I nodded. "All right, Lieutenant, tell me where to start." Outside, the night was quiet again, but I knew the silence wouldn't last, because silence never does. Pain has a way of teaching you things discipline never can. You can spend years drilling, perfecting, obeying, but one wound, one sharp edge of mortality will show you who you really are. The day I was hit, the air in Afghanistan was thick enough to chew. August heat pressed down on the valley like a lid. We had been out for hours on a reconnaissance sweep near Coast Province, tracking insurgent movement through a series of abandoned compounds. It was supposed to be low risk. They always say that before everything goes to hell. We were moving between ridgelines when the first round cracked the silence. It wasn't close, just a warning in the distance, the kind of sound that makes your bones wake up before your brain does. I dropped behind a rock, scanning with my scope. Dust rose in the distance, heat shimmer twisting the horizon, then another shot. This one hit closer. The voice on the radio barked coordinates, orders, static. I moved to reposition, crawling along the slope to get a better angle. My fingers were steady, my breath calm. Years of training collapse into instinct when survival depends on it. Then came the sound I'll never forget, the deep, heavy thud that isn't loud but final. The impact hit me in the side just above the hip, throwing me down hard. For a moment, I didn't realize what had happened. Pain arrived late, like lightning after thunder. I pressed my hand to the wound, felt the warmth spreading through my uniform. My radio crackled with voices, distant and panicked. Someone shouted my name. I remember the taste of dust, the sharp smell of cordite, and the single thought that rose above everything else: stay still, breathe, wait for the wind. Old habits never die. Even bleeding, I scanned for the source. Through the haze, I caught the faint flicker of movement on the far ridge, a sniper, maybe 2,000 meters out. My spotter was down the hill, too far to assist. The radio line was broken. It was just me and the distance between us. I don't remember making the decision. My hands moved on their own. I positioned the rifle, adjusted for wind drift, factored elevation. The pain pulsed with every heartbeat, each one shorter than the last. I lined up the shot and fired. Silence, then a figure collapsed. After that, everything blurred, medevac noise, the rotors beating the air, morphine burning through veins. I remember looking up at the sky through the open door of the chopper, the Afghan mountains fading beneath me like a map folding shut. They said I was lucky. The bullet had missed the artery by an inch. They called it a miracle, but in truth, luck isn't what keeps you alive. It's the refusal to give up before the final breath leaves your chest. Recovery was slow, too slow for someone who only knew how to move forward. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and resignation. The nights were the worst, the hum of machines, the quiet sobs from the next bed over. They had taken a piece of shrapnel out of me, but something deeper stayed, lodged inside guilt. Because no matter how many times I told myself I'd done what I had to, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of that single shot. That was the moment my career changed course. Command offered me reassignment, no more combat, no more deployments. They said I'd done my part. I smiled, nodded, and thanked them. But inside, it felt like they had taken the only language I ever spoke fluently: silence, distance, precision. When I was finally discharged from medical care, I went home to Montana. The land was wide and quiet, the kind of place where time doesn't rush. My father's old house still stood at the edge of the woods, the porch creaking the same way it always had. He was waiting for me. His hair was thinner, his back a little more bent. But his eyes hadn't changed. Blue-gray, sharp, steady eyes that could see through fog and lies and self-pity alike. "You made it home," he said simply. "I did." He looked at the cane I was using and frowned. "You gonna let that thing define you?" I smiled faintly. "Just using it till I don't need it." He nodded once. Good answer. The next morning, he woke me before sunrise. Old habits die hard with him too. He was already dressed. Coffee steaming in a thermos. "Come on," he said. "We've got work to do." He He led me down the dirt path behind the house, past the barn, through the trees, to the clearing we used to call the line. It was where he had taught me to shoot when I was 12. Back then, the targets were paper circles and tin cans. Later, deer silhouettes. By high school, I could hit a 6-inch plate at 1,000 yards. He set up the stand like we used to. Lined the targets along the far ridge. I hesitated. My leg ached, the wound pulling tight beneath the bandage. "I'm not sure I can hold position long enough," I said. "Handed me the rifle. Then start short. You build back distance one shot at a time." It felt strange at first, the weight of the rifle against my shoulder, the scent of gun oil and pine mixing in the air. But muscle memory is a stubborn thing. After a few rounds, my breathing steadied. My heart found its rhythm again. At 600 yards, I missed by a hand's width. At 800, I hit the edge. At 1,000, I clipped the center. My father just stood behind me. Silent, he didn't need to say anything. When I lowered the rifle, he finally spoke. "You see, the body forgets, but the mind remembers." I looked at him. "What about the fear?" He smiled faintly. "You don't erase it, you aim through it." That summer in Montana became my quiet recovery. Every morning I trained, breathing, adjusting, learning patience again. The distances grew longer. The pain dulled but never disappeared. It reminded me I was still human. Not a machine. Some nights I'd sit on the porch watching the horizon fade, thinking about the ones who never made it home. I'd feel the weight of my medal in a drawer, still wrapped in plastic. I never displayed it. Medals are for what people see, not for what it costs you to earn them. My father passed that fall, peacefully in his sleep. I found his old range notebook on his desk, filled with numbers, wind calculations, and scribbled notes in the margins. On the last page he'd written, "Patience turns distance into certainty." That line stayed with me long after the funeral. It became my creed. When command called months later asking if I'd consider returning to service, this time as an instructor, I said yes. I wasn't done yet. The wound had changed me, but not in the way they thought. It stripped away everything unessential. The noise, the pride, the need for recognition. What was left was focus. When I stepped back onto base for the first time after recovery, the smell of oil and dust hit me like déjà vu. I wasn't the same soldier who had left. The limp was lighter, the silence heavier, but beneath it all, something had hardened into purpose. Failure leaves scars, but scars are proof that you lived through what tried to end you. They are reminders, not of weakness, but of the price of precision. That's what I carry now, not medals, not rank. Just lessons written in flesh and memory, and one truth that never fades: you only have to be perfect once. Coming back to the Army felt like stepping into an old photograph where every color had faded, but every shadow still remembered its place. The walls smelled the same, the clang of rifles on racks, the echo of boots on concrete floors. Everything was familiar, yet nothing was the same. Maybe it wasn't the place that had changed. Maybe it was me. They stationed me at Fort Claiborne, a windswept base tucked between endless stretches of scrubland and desert. My assignment was simple on paper: train the next generation of long-range marksmen, evaluate equipment, and advise on sniper team protocols. It sounded safe enough, structured enough. But I've learned that no soldier truly comes back to safety. The battlefield just changes shape. The first morning I met Lieutenant Pierce, the desert was already awake, dust devils twisting across the range, the sun climbing fast and merciless. Pierce was young, sharp, and ambitious in the way new officers often are. He had the confidence of someone who believed leadership came from orders, not understanding. He was polite, but you could feel the unspoken question behind his eyes. What was a woman with a limp and a scar doing training combat snipers? He didn't say it aloud, not then, but the others didn't hide their doubts. They whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. Words like quota and desk-bound veteran traveled faster than bullets. I didn't correct them, not yet. Sometimes letting people underestimate you is the best form of camouflage. Pierce called for an evaluation drill that week, a full-distance shoot to test the new recruits. The targets were set at increasing ranges, starting at 400 yards and stretching out to 200. The air shimmered with heat, the wind playing its quiet tricks. "Torres," Pierce said, reading from his clipboard, "you'll observe firing line 2. Make adjustments if they drift too far off center." Understood. I moved along the row of prone shooters, watching their breathing, their trigger discipline, their posture. Most of them were green, but they had potential. One private kept jerking his shot just enough to throw his round 2 inches left. I crouched beside him. "Relax your shoulder," I said softly. "You're fighting the rifle instead of trusting it." He blinked at me, uncertain, then made the adjustment. The next shot hit center. When Pierce saw the improvement, he raised an eyebrow. "You've got a good eye," he said. "I had a good teacher," I replied. The training sessions grew longer as the days passed. We practiced through crosswinds, early dawn, late dusk. I taught them to read the wind like language, to count seconds between heartbeats, to measure patience as precisely as distance. But no amount of teaching could prepare you for the day everything turns real. 2 months into the rotation, I was called into Pierce's office. He was sitting at his desk, papers scattered, expression tight. "We've been asked to deploy a small Overwatch team," he said. "Intel indicates movement near the southern border. It's probably nothing, but they want eyes." I studied the satellite image spread before him. The terrain was rough canyon ridges, deep valleys, sparse vegetation, ideal for snipers and for ambushes. He hesitated before adding, "They want you on the team." I looked up. "You sure that's what you want?" He gave a thin smile. "I'm told you're the best shot on base, and I could use that." We left before dawn 2 days later. The Humvee rolled through the desert like a moving furnace, rattling with every bump. My rifle sat across my lap, clean, oiled, silent. As we reached the observation point, I felt the old rhythm settle back into me. Check, breathe, align, wait. The world narrowed to the sound of the wind and the weight of the trigger. Our mission was simple: watch the ridge. Identify any hostile movement, call it in. Hours passed without contact. The radio hummed with static and Pierce's steady breathing beside me. Around midday, I spotted it, a faint glint near the opposing ridge, like sunlight bouncing off glass. I shifted my scope. It wasn't glass, it was a scope, a sniper's scope. "Pierce," I whispered, 2 o'clock, 1,700 yards. He followed my line of sight, cursed under his breath. "Can you confirm?" "Firmed." He grabbed the radio to report, but before he could finish, the air split. The first shot hit a rock 2 feet from his head. We dropped flat, dust exploding around us. "Sniper fire," he hissed. I was already moving, sliding behind cover. My heart rate didn't spike. It never does in moments like that. The world just becomes sharper. I adjusted for distance, elevation, crosswind. The air shimmered between us, a mirage of heat and danger. Right. Pierce asked, 1,700, I said, eyes fixed through the scope. "That's too far. Wait for air support. By the time they get here, we'll be target practice." He hesitated. "You think you can make that shot?" I took a slow breath. The echo of Montana drifted through me, my father's voice, the cool morning air, the whisper of wind across the range. "The distance isn't the problem," I said. "The wind is." I adjusted again, factoring the drift. The target moved slightly, just a ripple of movement through heat waves. My finger rested against the trigger. I felt the pulse in my wrist sink with the earth. Then I fired. The recoil hit my shoulder. Familiar and grounding. Through the scope, I watched the figure on the ridge drop out of sight. Silence stretched. Pierce stared at me. "You got him?" I kept watching, no movement. "Yes," he exhaled, part disbelief, part relief. "Jesus Torres, that was 1,700 yards. I kept my voice even. "I've done farther." We waited for extraction. When command reviewed the footage later, the ballistic computer confirmed the hit at 726 yards with a wind deviation of less than half a mil. Pierce couldn't stop talking about it for days. I didn't say much, because in truth, it wasn't pride that filled me. It was something heavier. Every time I make a shot like that, I think of the first one that nearly killed me. The blood, the dust, the silence after. I think of the lesson buried in that wound. That precision has a price, and you never stop paying it. When we returned to base, word had spread fast. Soldiers I'd never spoken to before stopped me in the mess hall. Some called me Eagle Eye. Others just nodded, quiet respect in their eyes. The same mouths that once whispered now stayed shut. Pierce found me later that week at the range. He leaned against the rail, arms folded. "I misjudged you," he said simply. "I get that a lot," I told him. He chuckled. "You know, command wants to recommend you for commendation." "I don't need another medal." "I figured you'd say that." He hesitated. "Why do you do it then? You could have stayed safe. You had every reason to walk away." I looked down the range, the endless stretch of distance under the sun, because someone has to hit the target when no one else can. He nodded slowly. "That's one hell of a reason." The next morning before sunrise, I went to the range alone. The air was cool, quiet. The kind of silence that makes you believe the world might hold its breath for a while. I set up the rifle, checked the scope, adjusted the angle. Then I aimed at a target 2,000 yards out. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering who I was before the wound, before the doubt. The shot broke the air like glass. A second later, the spotter's flag lifted on the far ridge center hit. For a moment, everything went still. No noise, no pain, no past. Just breathe, distance, and precision. That's the thing about scars. People think they mark where you were broken, but sometimes they mark where you were rebuilt. If you're still here listening, maybe you know what that feels like, to carry a piece of your past like a shadow, not to hide it, but to remind yourself of the distance you've already covered. Because in the end, strength isn't measured in medals or rank. It's measured in the quiet moments when no one's watching, when you decide to stand up again, aim steady, and keep moving forward. There's a strange silence that fills a shooting range right before a test begins. It isn't the quiet of peace. It's the kind that hums beneath your skin, a silence built on nerves, pride, and the unspoken competition between people who all want to prove something. That morning, the air over Fort Claiborne shimmered with the kind of heat that makes the distance between you and the target look like it's breathing. The flags along the field fluttered lightly from the south. A steady 9 kilometers per hour. Not ideal, but predictable. Predictable meant control, and control was everything. The command post had organized an advanced qualification trial for the sniper candidates. It wasn't unusual, but what made this one different was who was watching. Senior officers, instructors, evaluators, and General Strauss himself, the head of training command. His presence alone was enough to turn a normal drill into a high-stakes show. Rumor spread fast that morning. Word was Strauss had doubts about my reinstatement, about whether a woman who had been wounded and sidelined for years should be instructing snipers at all. Maybe this was his way of finding out for himself. When my name appeared at the bottom of the firing order, I understood exactly what he intended. Let her go last. Let everyone else perform first. Let her feel the weight of 100 eyes waiting for her to fail. I didn't mind. I'd been underestimated by better men. The recruits lined up one by one, taking their turns. The targets were set at increasing ranges, 600, 900, and the final at 200 meters, standard maximum for qualification, the kind of distance where even minor errors look catastrophic through a scope. The first shooter hit 2 out of 3. The next missed entirely. The air was thick with sweat and dust and that quiet, heavy pressure of performance. When my name was called, the whispers started. Finally, let's see if the legend can shoot or just talk. I bet she doesn't even hit the board. I'll buy dinner if she lands one. I didn't answer. I just walked to the line, my Barrett cradled like an extension of myself. The range officer glanced at me and hesitated. You're good to fire when ready, Sergeant Torres. Copy. I laid down, adjusted the bipod, and looked through the scope. The world narrowed to one circle of glass. The target shimmered at the far end of the field, the faint outline of a black square painted against the beige dust. I could almost feel my father's voice in the wind. Start with the wind, always the wind. I watched the small red flag near the 800-meter mark. It swayed steadily left, 9 kilometers per hour, steady crosswind. I dialed 2 clicks right. Temperature difference was mild, 5 degrees Celsius above baseline. That meant a slight air density shift, maybe a 1/10 of a mil drop at distance. I adjusted elevation accordingly. My breathing slowed. Inhale, exhale, pause. First shot, the Barrett roared. The recoil kicked into my shoulder, deep but steady. Through the scope, I watched the target ripple. A second later, the impact mark appeared just left of center. Murmurs from the line, second shot. I made a half-click correction. Fired. The mark landed dead center. The voices quieted. One more. I could feel the heartbeat in my throat, not from fear, but from focus. My world had shrunk to the size of a coin at 1,200 meters. I waited for the wind to steady. Then I pulled the trigger. The third round tore through the same center mark, widening the hole already there. 3 rounds, 3 targets, all within a span of 20 centimeters. Silence fell like a curtain. No one moved. The spotter lifted his binoculars, double-checked, then called out, voice slightly shaking. All 3 confirmed center hits. Even General Strauss stopped mid-step. I pushed myself up slowly, brushed the dust from my uniform, and locked the Barrett back into safety. Around me, the recruits stared as if they were seeing me for the first time. Someone let out a low whistle. Another muttered, "No way." Strauss approached, his shadow falling over the shooting mat. "That was clean," he said. "What was your correction on wind?" 2 clicks right at 9 kilometers per hour, sir. Temperature shift 5 degrees. Adjusted for density altitude at baseline. He raised an eyebrow. You did that all in your head. Yes, sir, that's standard practice, isn't it? He gave a short, almost reluctant smile. For most people, it's not. Behind him, I saw Lieutenant Pierce watching, arms crossed, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. It wasn't the kind of grin that said, "I told you so." It was quieter, almost proud. As the others packed up, Strauss lingered. "Sergeant Torres," he said, "report to my office this afternoon." There was no tone of reprimand, but something about his expression told me this wasn't over. Back in the barracks, the whispers had turned to awe. Some of the same soldiers who'd mocked me earlier now nodded respectfully as I passed. Others avoided my eyes, as if unsure what to do with their own words now that they'd seen me shoot. Pierce found me sitting by the armory later that day, cleaning the Barrett with slow, practiced motions. "You realize you just shut down half the gossip on this base," he said. "I wasn't trying to make a point. You made one anyway." He sat across from me, his tones softening. "You ever get tired of proving people wrong?" I thought about that for a moment. "You only get tired if you start doing it for them. I shoot for me." That afternoon, when I walked into General Strauss's office, the blinds were half closed, slanting light across his desk. He gestured for me to sit. On his computer, I saw my personnel file open, pages of classified entries, redacted lines, and blacked-out mission reports. "You've been holding back, Sergeant," he said quietly. I stayed silent. He tapped a key and a digital record appeared. "Operation Breakwater, classified engagement, confirmed distance 610 meters. Sniper ID code 07V Torres." He looked up. "That's you, isn't it?" I took a breath. "Yes, sir." His eyes narrowed slightly. "The report says your shot neutralized a high-value target, prevented civilian casualties, and saved an entire assault team from ambush. I did my job." He studied me for a long moment, then leaned back. "You know, that shot isn't in any official record, not even in long-range sniper archives. Why? Because it wasn't supposed to be about the shot, it was about the mission." He nodded slowly. "You understand, that distance, that's beyond what's considered humanly possible with a standard Barrett. We had engineers verify it twice." "I know, so why did you tell anyone?" I looked down at my hands, still faintly smelling of oil and metal. "Because the people who needed to know already knew. Everyone else just wants a story." Strauss sat quietly for a while, then closed the file. "You're an anomaly, Sergeant, a good one. I'm reassigning you to advanced operations. You'll help evaluate new long-range systems and train elite candidates. Your methods are unconventional, but they work." I nodded. "Understood, sir." As I stood to leave, he added, "One more thing. Next time you perform like that, don't hide it. People need to see what quiet competence looks like." Outside, the sun was dipping low behind the hangars, painting the desert in gold and copper. I stopped for a moment, watching the horizon blur with heat. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible, not celebrated, not famous, just seen. If you've ever carried a skill that no one believed in until the day you proved it, you'll understand that feeling. It's not triumph, it's peace. And in that peace, I finally understood what my father meant when he said patience turns distance into certainty. The week after my reassignment felt like walking into the same storm from a different direction. Everything looked familiar, same uniforms, same dusty light spilling across the yard, same sound of boots scraping concrete, but now the eyes that followed me held something different. Not doubt, not disdain, expectation. General Strauss's orders were simple: design and oversee a live long-range simulation for the advanced sniper candidates. It wasn't just a test of marksmanship. It was a test of command, coordination, and nerve, real conditions, real pressure. The kind of exercise where everything that can go wrong usually does. Pierce was assigned as the operations officer. When I stepped into the planning room, he was already there, pacing between maps and range schematics. "So this is your show now," he said. "You've got 12 candidates, 3 observation posts, and one very ambitious general who wants a perfect demonstration for his visiting brass." I smiled faintly. "No pressure then." Pierce grinned. "Pressure's what you do best." We went over the layout, a simulated hostage rescue scenario in the desert foothills outside Claiborne. 3 teams would be stationed along staggered ridge lines, coordinating overwatch and precision coverage across nearly 2 miles of broken terrain. I'd supervise and mentor from the forward observation post. The forecast called for shifting winds, not ideal, but then again, perfection never taught anyone anything. On the morning of the exercise, the air felt heavy, that dry, electric stillness before the sun burns everything to white. The recruits gathered near the trucks, double-checking gear. Some of them still wore the same smirks from months ago, but they didn't say much now. I noticed one Private Callahan, the same young man who once bet I couldn't hit a target at 600 yards. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his scope. I crouched beside him. "You nervous?" I asked. He hesitated. "A little, ma'am, it's the wind." "Good, that means you respect it." I handed him a small card from my pocket, a worn, laminated cheat sheet with ballistic corrections. "You won't always have time for math. Trust your eyes. Read the signs: dust, grass, mirage. The wind tells the truth if you listen." He nodded, pocketing the card like it was something sacred. We rolled out before dawn. By the time we reached the observation posts, the sun was a pale scar above the horizon. The team set up quickly, rifles settling into their bipods, scopes glinting in the early light. The radio crackled with coded chatter, tension woven into every syllable. At 0700 hours, the exercise began. The enemy positions, remote-controlled targets disguised as hostiles, activated across the valley floor. The teams took their readings, adjusting for distance. Team Alpha, target range 950 meters, I called. Copy. The first shot cracked through the air. Dust kicked from the target's edge, missed by a fraction. "Check your drift, adjust .2 mils right," I said calmly. The second round hit home. For the next hour, the desert echoed with controlled chaos, rifles barking, radios buzzing, orders traded like currency. I moved between positions, watching posture, breathing, and rhythm. Teaching in the middle of pressure wasn't about barking orders. It was about steadying hearts. But around 0930, the weather turned. The wind shifted hard from the west, gusting irregularly 15, then 20 kilometers per hour, changing direction like a restless animal. At that distance, it turned a 1-inch margin into a 10-foot miss. The recruits panicked. Miss after miss. Calls came in over the radio, overlapping, confused. "Ma'am, targets moving east, visibility dropping." Alpha team losing line of sight. Bravo team requests recalculation. I grabbed my rangefinder, scanning. Through the haze, I saw a cluster of moving silhouettes on the far ridge, the last hostage unit being moved by mock hostiles. It was 400 meters out, crosswind 18 clicks, shifting fast. Pierce's voice came through my earpiece. "We're losing the scenario, Torres. You want me to call abort?" "No," I said. "We finished this." I dropped to the mat, unlatched my Barrett. Took position, patched me into Team Charlie's comms. Static, then a nervous voice crackled through. "Ma'am, this wind's chewing us up. We can't get a reading." "Then let me help you." I took a deep breath, watching the grass bend, the mirage twist. Montana came back to me, those endless afternoons with my father counting seconds between gusts, listening to the earth instead of fighting it. "Listen up," I said quietly into the mic. "Count the rhythm. It's pulsing in threes. Wait for the lull between shifts, not after it. Aim just above the shoulder. Let the wind carry it in." They hesitated, uncertain. "I'll take the lead shot," I said. "You mirror my hold." I adjusted for distance, 420 meters. Elevation dropped 38 inches. Crosswind correction, 3 mils left. My heartbeat slowed. The noise fell away. I fired. The shot sliced through the wind, a heavy crack that rolled down the valley. Through the scope, I saw the lead target jerk backward, collapsing perfectly. "Now," I said. 3 more rifles fired in sequence. 4 targets dropped within seconds. The radio went silent except for breathing. Then someone whispered, "Holy hell." Even Pierce sounded stunned. "You just made a 400-meter headshot in 20-click crosswind." "Correction," I said softly. "We did." When the exercise ended, the evaluators confirmed every hit. Out of 24 total engagements, 21 were direct hits. It was the highest accuracy rating the base had recorded in years. Back at the command tent, Strauss was already reviewing footage. When he saw me, he pointed at the monitor. "That wind correction sequence you called, that wasn't in the manual." "It isn't something you can write down," I said. "You have to feel it." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Whatever it was, it worked. You just made those kids believe in the impossible." Outside, the recruits were still buzzing. Callahan approached, face flushed, voice trembling with adrenaline. "Ma'am, that shot, that was unreal. I didn't think it was even possible." I looked at him. "Neither did I once." He smiled. Guess I owe you dinner. Save your money. Just promise me you'll remember something. What's that? That distance doesn't matter. Focus does. That night, the desert cooled fast. I sat by the range alone, the rifle beside me, the air still carrying faint echoes of gunfire. The stars stretched wide overhead, cold and infinite. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift inside, not pride, but peace. The kind that comes when you realize you've done your part and done it well. Pierce joined me after a while, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. You know, he said, Strauss called this the most successful exercise he's seen in 15 years. Good for him. He laughed softly. You really don't care about recognition, do you? I shook my head. Recognition fades. Precision doesn't. He looked out toward the horizon. So what now? I thought about that. About the scars, the lessons, the long, quiet years of being underestimated and forgotten. About my father's voice on the range, telling me that patience turns distance into certainty. Now, I said, I teach them to see what silence can do. The wind stirred, gentle now, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and dust. I picked up the rifle, ran my hand along its cool metal. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was memory, discipline, redemption. And maybe, just maybe, it was proof that even the quietest soldiers could leave the loudest marks. If you've made it this far, remember this: the world might doubt you, underestimate you, even forget you. But when your moment comes, when the distance between you and your purpose stretches farther than you ever thought possible, you'll find that patience, precision, and heart can bridge it all. That's not just a lesson for soldiers. That's a lesson for anyone who's ever been told they couldn't. It started with a knock on the door that morning. 3 short taps, sharp and deliberate, echoing across the quiet barracks hallway. I was sitting at my desk, dismantling my rifle piece by piece, the same ritual I'd done 1,000 times before. Each motion calmed me, the cool slide of the bolt, the faint click of steel against my palm, the smell of oil and dust. Lieutenant Pierce stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He didn't bother with small talk. Maya, the general wants to see you, now. Meetings with General Strauss weren't casual affairs. You didn't get called in unless something was about to change. I gathered my notebook, wiped my hands, and followed Pierce down the hall. The command center was colder than usual, humming with the low sound of servers and projectors. Inside, Strauss stood near a screen filled with military data, unit histories, mission logs, encrypted documents marked classified. He didn't look at me right away. Sergeant Torres, he said finally, we've been reviewing personnel records after last week's simulation. I noticed something unusual in your file. There are sections redacted under clearance levels higher than my own. I stayed silent. There was nothing I could say without permission to say it. He turned toward me. You served under the 3rd Recon Support Group, correct? Yes, sir. And during Operation Red Veil. Your name appears in a supporting capacity, but the mission report doesn't specify what that support was. Care to explain why? I met his gaze. No, sir, that operation is still under classification. Pierce shifted uncomfortably beside me. General, if I may, Strauss raised a hand. No, Lieutenant, I want to hear it from her. There are moments in a soldier's life when the truth feels heavier than silence. This was one of them. My throat felt dry, but my voice stayed steady. With respect, sir, some truths aren't meant to be told out loud. They're meant to be understood by those who need them. Strauss stared for a long moment, then he turned back to the monitor, typing a few commands. The screen changed to a grainy still image, a satellite capture of a mountain valley, date stamped nearly 6 years ago. A red marker indicated an enemy position. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, Strauss said. Mission code RV7. Our analysts decrypted this record last night. It lists a confirmed long-range elimination at 2,400 meters. Pierce blinked. 2,400. Strauss nodded. According to this, it was the longest recorded engagement by a member of the unit. 1 shot, 1 kill. Preparation time, 2 hours, 45 minutes. Impact delay, 2.7 seconds. Shooter listed under codename Luna. The room went quiet. The hum of the machines filled the space between heartbeats. Strauss turned toward me again. You wouldn't happen to know who Luna is, would you, Sergeant? I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Luna. The name hadn't been spoken in years. It wasn't a title. It was a burden. I do, I said quietly. She's standing right here. The general leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose. Pierce looked like he'd just seen a ghost. I knew it, he whispered. That's why you never missed. That's why the wind never rattled you. Strauss folded his arms. Why wasn't this disclosed? It was never meant to be, I said. Red Veil wasn't about recognition. It was about survival. The general nodded, half to himself. The report says you neutralized a high-value target responsible for downing 2 medevac helicopters. You saved 18 personnel that day. That wasn't the plan, I said softly. It was supposed to be reconnaissance only, but plans change. He looked back at the screen, the old image frozen in time, 2 hours and 45 minutes. What does someone even think about in that kind of silence? I met his eyes. You don't think, you breathe. You measure the world in the space between your heartbeats, every gust of wind, every grain of dust. When the shot finally comes, it's not instinct, it's inevitability. He nodded slowly. You understand that when this becomes public record, you'll be the most talked about sniper in modern U.S. military history. I shook my head. That's not the story that needs to be told. Pierce spoke up, his voice quiet but certain. Then tell us the one that does. So I did. I told them about that day in Helmand, the heat shimmering off the rocks, the way the horizon blurred into sky. The target was hidden inside an abandoned communications outpost halfway across the valley. The distance was brutal. The air density was thin. Every variable was against me. I remember lying in the dirt, adjusting the scope until the world narrowed into a single point. The radio chatter behind me was static and panic. There was no time for calculation anymore. I'd already done that. Wind, 11 kilometers per hour, shifting north by northwest. Temperature differential, 6 degrees Celsius. Bullet drop nearly 40 inches. My father's voice came back to me from Montana. Patience is precision, Maya. Every breath is a choice. When the call came in that the enemy was preparing to move, I took one final breath. 2.7 seconds later, the valley went silent. It wasn't pride I felt, it was relief, and then grief. Strauss listened without interruption. When I finished, he said quietly, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Because it wasn't about me," I said. "It was about the medevac team that made it home. The soldiers who got to call their families that night. That was enough." He nodded again, more slowly this time. "You realize, Sergeant, that humility like that doesn't erase the impact. It magnifies it." Pierce smiled faintly. "Guess the quiet ones really do carry the loudest echoes." The general looked at me once more, his tone softer. "We'll make sure your record reflects the truth this time." I didn't respond right away. The truth had a way of changing things. Once it was out, you couldn't pull it back. But maybe I thought that was finally okay. That night, I walked out to the range again. The air was cool, the stars sharp above me. I set the rifle down and just listened to the wind. Somewhere out there in the quiet, the ghosts of every shot I'd ever taken seemed to breathe with me. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel it, not the weight of what I'd done, but the grace of still being here to remember. If this story finds you tonight, maybe you'll understand something. Strength isn't about the noise we make. It's about the silence we endure and the truths we finally decide to speak. By the next morning, word had already begun to spread. No one said how, but in military bases, news travels faster than bullets. You could almost feel it in the air, a shift in tone, a ripple through conversations that used to stop when I walked into the room. I noticed it first at breakfast. The usual noise of trays and chatter filled the mess hall, but when I stepped through the line, the talking slowed, heads turned. For the first time, the silence wasn't laced with judgment. It was something else, recognition. Private Callahan caught my eye from across the room. He looked nervous, then stood and gave a small nod. Not a salute, not the sharp snap of formality, just acknowledgement, the kind that passes between soldiers who have seen more than they ever meant to. It would have been easier if they'd kept ignoring me, but there's something heavier about being seen after years of being invisible. You start to wonder if you still deserve it. Later that day, Pierce found me at the range where I was running drills alone. The wind was calm, the sun already dipping low behind the hills. He leaned against the post, watching quietly as I fired a clean grouping at 800 meters. "You're trending," he said, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Trending?" I lowered the rifle. "There's a file making rounds in the internal network. Someone leaked a piece of your record, just the numbers. 2,400 meters. 2.7 seconds, one confirmed target. No names, but everyone knows who it is now." I sighed. "That's supposed to be classified." "Yeah," he said, "and yet here we are." He stepped closer, his tone softening. "You can't hide forever, Maya. You've spent your whole life avoiding attention, but maybe now it's time to let people see why you matter. I don't want the spotlight." then don't take it for yourself, take it for the ones who will follow you. His words stayed with me long after he left. By the end of the week, I was summoned again, this time to the auditorium. The briefing memo said recognition ceremony, special commendation for exemplary performance. I almost didn't go, but curiosity or maybe duty won. When I walked in, the room was packed. Rows of uniforms filled the seats, the air thick with that blend of anticipation and discomfort that only happens when something historic is about to unfold. On the stage, General Strauss stood behind the podium, papers in hand. He spotted me and gestured to the front row. "Sergeant Torres, please." As I sat, I caught sight of the recruits I'd trained, their faces shining with a mix of pride and disbelief. Callahan sat near the end, straight-backed, his hands clasped tightly. Strauss began to speak. "In this line of work, we learn early that not every hero wears the medals they deserve. Some carry their honor quietly, buried beneath silence and service. Today, we correct that silence." He turned a page, his voice steady but weighted. "During a review of classified operations, this command discovered that one of our own, Sergeant Maya Torres, served under an alternate designation in Operation Red Veil. Her actions directly saved the lives of 18 personnel under fire. Her marksmanship was not just exceptional, it was record-breaking. A confirmed engagement at 400 meters under adverse conditions, the longest of its kind recorded at the time." The room murmured. Even those who'd heard the rumors seemed stunned by the official confirmation. Strauss continued. "For years, this record remained buried under classification. But some stories deserve daylight, not for fame, not for decoration, but because they remind us of what discipline and quiet courage look like." He motioned toward me. Sergeant Torres, front and center. I stood, the sound of my boots on the wooden floor louder than I expected. My heart thudded against my ribs. I'd faced incoming fire, held my breath for hours under desert sun, but this, standing before my own peers, felt infinitely harder. Strauss met me halfway and handed me a small case. Inside, a single silver commendation gleamed under the stage light. "For exceptional precision, valor, and integrity under fire," he said, "and for redefining what strength looks like in silence." For a moment, no one moved. Then applause rose, not the perfunctory kind that fills a ceremony, but something raw and real. It rolled across the room like a tide. I could see it in their faces, awe, respect, and maybe even a hint of shame for the years they doubted me. Pierce stood near the back, clapping slowly, his eyes meeting mine. He gave a small, knowing nod. Afterward, when the hall emptied, I stayed behind. The metal felt strange in my hand, almost too heavy for its size. I ran my thumb along the edge, thinking about my father again, about the long drives in Montana, about the girl who once believed her worth was measured by how well she could disappear. That girl was gone now. Outside, the sun was setting over the training field, painting everything gold and quiet. The same recruits who once laughed at me were running evening drills, their rifles steady, their movements sharper than before. I watched for a while before Callahan spotted me. "Ma'am," he called out, jogging over, "congratulations, you deserve this more than anyone." I smiled faintly. "That's kind of you, Private. How's your aim?" "Getting better, still not 2,000-meter better." "Get there," I said. "Just remember, patience outlasts talent." He grinned. "That one's going on my locker." When he ran back to the line, I looked at the horizon again. The wind had picked up slightly, brushing across my face like a whisper. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was the real reward, not the medal, not the applause, but the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, my silence had finally taught something worth remembering. That night, the base was unusually calm. The mess hall was quiet, the range empty. I took a walk down the perimeter road, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The stars looked sharper than usual, the kind of night sky you only get far from cities and noise. For years, I'd thought of silence as my shield. Now I realized it had been my teacher. It had shown me how to wait, how to see, how to listen, not just to wind and distance, but to people, to pain, to purpose. I thought of every soldier I'd met, the loud ones, the broken ones, the ones who carried invisible battles behind stoic eyes. They were all part of this unseen story, the quiet heartbeat that kept the world turning. As I passed the armory, I saw my reflection in the glass, older, steadier, maybe even a little at peace. The file, the shot, the legend, none of it defined me anymore. What mattered was what came next, teaching others to find strength in patience. Honor the calm before the storm. to understand that silence doesn't mean weakness, it means readiness. If you've been listening this far, maybe you know someone like that, someone who never asks for credit but always shows up when it matters most. Maybe it's you, and if it is, I hope you remember this. History doesn't always remember the loudest voices. Sometimes it remembers the steady hands, the measured breath, the unseen heroes who do their work quietly and perfectly. This wasn't just my story. It was a reminder of every quiet soldier still out there, waiting for their moment. And if my story helps even one of them believe again, then every second of silence was worth it. The alert came in over the radio like a cold thing dropped into the center of my stomach. Static, then a clipped voice I only half recognized. Enemy movement confirmed near a civilian compound. Hostages taken. Command requesting immediate overwatch. Time to execution is estimated to be 12 minutes. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when the clock is counting down. All the excess life strips away. You stop thinking about how loud things are, about what people whisper or how they looked at you last week. You only think about what is directly in front of your eyes and how much of it you can change before the seconds run out. We moved fast and quietly. The Overwatch team assembled at the forward position, rifles slung, optics covered, comms operating on low. I felt the old rhythm return with each step. Check your gear, check your angles. Lock into the mental map of how wind behaves over ridgeline and water, how temperature and elevation bend a bullet's path like a secret math. The Barrett sat heavy in my hands, familiar and patient, like an old workhorse that knew exactly which day it would be needed and was ready to do the job. Pierce kept his voice low, barely more than breath. Get eyes on the target, call coordinates, maintain radio silence until necessary. The squad moved into position, each of us finding a socket in the landscape where we could see the world without being seen. The compound lay tucked under a fold of rock, a place that looked invulnerable from the road. The enemy had learned where to hide, and they had learned how to make it dangerous to come close. We had the kind of intel that chills you and keeps you moving. Hostages were reported in a courtyard within the compound. The enemy had tied a deadline to the situation. 12 minutes until they began executing hostages. No time for a ground assault, no safe approach that wouldn't cost more lives. The only option was a single precision engagement from distance. Single shot, perfect call, no second attempts, all or nothing. The weight of what that means sits differently in your body than an ordinary fear. When there is one shot to save lives, every tiny thing about you becomes an instrument of that outcome. Your breathing is measured. Your heartbeat is an internal metronome. Your patience is not passive. It is active, a calling of variables into alignment. We set up. I lay prone behind the Barrett, bipod dug into the sand, scope clean to a bright clarity that made the distant valley look almost like a painted scene. Targets that would be huge at close range were nothing but a smudge at the far end of the lens. The distance readout on our equipment confirmed it, 600 meters. Not the longest distance I had ever engaged, but this one mattered more than any particular number. This one had a deadline. I spent the first minutes of my wait doing everything I always do to keep my hands and my head steady. Check the zero on the sight, run through the ballistic table in my head, factor bullet weight, barrel temperature, humidity, and the slight change in air density as the sun inched higher. The wind was fickle that day, gusting and shifting like something alive. It was around 9 to 12 kilometers per hour at surface level. But at the different altitudes between here and the target, the vectors changed. That difference could send a bullet miles off course at this distance. So we watched, not in that restless, anxious way people imagine waiting, but with the specialized patience that comes from training. We had sent a spotter drone earlier, a small buzzing piece of metal that fed us a grainy video feed. The drone gave us movement and an idea of the enemy's posture, but not the precise vector of atmospheric turbulence. For that, we relied on the earth and the way the air shimmered above it. 2 hours and 40 minutes in, I felt like I had been waiting my whole life. My throat was dry, my shoulder ached from the weight, my mind was a clean list of numbers and scenarios. The team rotated positions, someone brought me water without a word, and we watched the compound waiting for the wrong noise to happen. Sometimes in that long silence. Background life surfaces. I thought of my father teaching me to count the rhythm of a valley wind, of summer afternoons in Montana when we would sit on a ridge and listen to the world. Those lessons had become a muscle memory. In crises, you do not have time to invent calm. You must find it inside stories you have already lived. At minute 10 on the countdown, the enemy commander began pacing the courtyard. The radio in my ear buzzed briefly with background chatter about movement. The time to act shrank like a pocket knife folding. We had to be absolutely sure. One misjudgment and the hostages would die. I adjusted. Half a mil right for gust shift, 3 full mils down for elevation compensating for the valley, an extra tenth for the temperature gradient between ridge and compound. The math added up in my hands, and then it became something else, not numbers, but a kind of intuition shaped like the muscles of my face, like a steady throat. I did not want to think about the flight time, but numbers are stubborn. At 600 meters, the bullet would be in the air for approximately 8 seconds. That is a long time for a piece of metal to be committed to a path. It is also an eternity in which everything else can change. A gust of wind, a stumble, a hand raised too soon. You develop a taste for those seconds. They become brand markers for your courage and decision-making. My finger found the trigger. The world narrowed to a clock and a sight. I squeezed. The report ripped through the valley. The recoil kissed my shoulder the way the barrel tells you it has done its part. Through the scope, I tracked the splash of dirt on the compound wall. The figure in the courtyard faltered, then went still. Impact, 2.8 seconds had passed. The radio came alive, voices brittle with disbelief, then with careful, controlled command. Confirmed, target neutralized, hostages secure, extraction inbound. I remember the way my knees felt suddenly vacant when the announcement went out. Not relief, numberless with joy, not triumph. The rush was sharp and immediate and full of a grief I didn't know I would carry, because each life saved had been paid for with a readiness that bordered on cruelty. You train for the finality of it, and then you must live with the human weight of the consequence. Those are the parts they never write into commendations. The team moved in like a mechanical ballet. Extraction was surgical and precise. The hostages were pulled out. Blankets wrapped around their shoulders, eyes wide and wet, voices small and disbelieving. Soldiers moved with the clean, efficient kindness of people whose job it is to hold small hands and break bad news gently. When the last civilian was loaded into the med vehicle, the compound emptied and our radios fell into a different rhythm. You could hear the bass breathe again. The men around me said little. There were no whoops, no wild congratulations. It was all quieter than that. Mostly there were looks, a hum under the skin of the unit that meant more than applause. Later in the debrief tent, they fed numbers and trajectories through the computer, tracing the flight path, verifying the 2.8 seconds, running wind tunnel analytics and physics that tried to capture the magic of what we had all been part of but never fully could. An engineer muttered something about margin of error and probability and how close everything had hung. They ran it 3 times just to make sure the computers agreed. Pierce sat there with his palms clasped. Jaw tight, how close were we to losing them? He asked, not for effect. The answer drew a soft, exhausted breath out of me, a hair less than we can afford. The headlines didn't come, not then, not in the way a story wants to crest and fall into the public. This was real work, compartmentalized, official, and consequently quiet. Some things do not make the noise of civilian life because they are meant to be kept out of the public ledger. That secrecy is part protection and part weight, and it sat on my shoulders the way a cloak sits over armor. When the unit came back to base, you could feel the change. Not the type of change that is swift and loud, but the slow, dense kind that rearranges where people put their trust. The recruits who had laughed months before now offered a small, careful respect. The old men who had smirked at my maintenance duty approached with different eyes. People asked me about weather tables, about how I judged mirage, about which ballistic calculator settings I favored. They asked practical questions like students who want to learn more. That kind of curiosity is a softer form of honor. But you do not really become a person of legend because of one shot. You become a legend by how you carry yourself after it. Many people spoke of the distance. They wrote down the 2,600 meters and the 8-second flight time in their notebooks. But what most of them weren't able to quantify was the thing the shot had actually done. It bought minutes for survival. It allowed people to live in rooms where they might have died. It shifted the story of a dozen families back toward a season where bedtimes existed and tea cooled on the table. The laughter that had once stung me now felt distant and small, like pebbles thrown into a wide river. We returned to our routines with a subtle steadiness. The medal that Strauss had placed in my hand weeks ago stayed in a small drawer, folded into the corner where I kept the things that mattered and the things that did not. At night, I would sometimes lie awake and run through the flight time in my mind, 2.8 seconds. It is a number that sounds cold, but it keeps warm in my chest. The ones who had been saved did not know the calculus that went into those seconds. They only knew that they had been given back the chance to breathe for another day. There were moments when peers approached me with tearful thanks from relatives they had not expected to see again. Those small conversations left more lasting imprints than any medal. No one who had been there seemed eager to make a spectacle. They offered their gratitude like a hand extended across the table, honest and practical. A few days later, a junior officer remarked in passing that silence mattered more than noise, and he was met with nods rather than scoffs. People began to understand that being quiet does not equal being small. In the weeks that followed, I found myself walking the perimeter at dawn, rifle slung, watching the sun push the night back into ordinary life. The world keeps moving, and yet you carry inside you the knowledge of what happened in a compacted space of 2.8 seconds. It hums like a string you can pluck and hear the note of. It is the echo of a choice. If this part of the story resonates with you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to Military Revenge for more accounts of lives lived in the narrow places where courage is cultivated. Even small gestures help us honor those who do their work without seeking the spotlight. Returning to a life that contains both the loud and the quiet requires balance. After the operation, my days were full of debriefs and quiet meetings, and nights were for reflection. The team grew closer in a way that banded us together under an unspoken contract. We had done something without fanfare, and that shared secret builds loyalty the way fire builds a hearth. Callahan stopped by one evening to talk. He had the nervous way of someone who had been hardened by training but softened by what he'd witnessed. "Ma'am," he said, sitting on the crate beside me, "why do you keep cleaning that rifle even when it's spotless?" His voice was tentative, like he was asking about sacred practice. I smiled without humor, because maintenance keeps you honest. It's how you make sure the weapon speaks the same language every time. It's how you make a promise to the people who depend on you that you will be ready. He nodded. "I get that. I think I do." Then he looked at me, eyes serious. "Do you ever regret it? All of it?" The question was simple and vast. Regret is a cold thing to answer. I thought of the nights in Afghanistan and the hum of the chopper, of the ache in my side and the way the valley folded away beneath me. I thought of my father in Montana and his quiet lessons. Sometimes regret sits on your shoulders like a familiar coat. Other times it is a teacher. Regret is complicated, I said finally. I regret the things I was forced to do for lack of better choice, but I do not regret being the person who acted. The cost is heavy, but to live with the knowledge that I did nothing would be heavier. He left quieter than he had arrived. That night I lay awake longer than usual. The stars were a map of other lives, and I kept tracing them with my eyes. The compound operation lived in my head like a small shrine of memory. I had done what I did because it had to be done, but I kept thinking about the ripple effects. Mother's voice, children's bedtime rituals, the way a single life touches many others. That is what made the shot real. It was not about the physics. It was about the human element the physics served. A few weeks later, the base held a small ceremony of recognition, organized informally by the men and women who had been saved by quick action on the ground and by professionals who knew the calculus of risk. It was not the type of public event with cameras and headlines, but it mattered more for its intimacy. The families who had been kept from losing someone stood in the shade of a makeshift pavilion and spoke about ordinary mornings returned. One woman pressed a small envelope into my hand, the edges soft from handling. Inside was a note from a father who said simply that his son had come home for graduation because someone had decided to take a long, cold shot and hold it true. Events like that are the currency of real gratitude. They do not sparkle under spotlights. They glow slowly like embers. I kept the note in the pocket of my field jacket for a long time, feeling the crumpled edges every time I put on the coat. People began to ask me more often about the technical side of long-range engagement. They asked about ballistic tables, about how I adjusted for the Coriolis effect when shots stretch into multiple seconds of flight. I answer them in practical terms, providing numerical data and the reasoning behind variables. The mechanics fascinate people, but the quiet part is always the harder sell. Most would rather talk about gear than the emotional work of waiting. That emotional labor will not be measured in manuals, but it shows up in the steadiness of a trigger pull and in the way someone breathes while the world holds its breath. One night, long after most had turned in, I found myself in the armory, cleaning not because I had to, but because my hands needed it. Pierce walked in, carrying his thermos, and sat across from me without asking. We shared that peculiar silence that no outsiders would recognize. Two veterans cleaning their tools, two people who had seen too much to make a show of it. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" he asked finally. I had thought about it. The call from command about reassignments and evaluations had quieted. The long term was less certain than ever. "Maybe," I admitted. "Montana calls in the way it always has." He nodded slowly. "You'll be missed." "Will I asked, half to myself, "or do they just like having a perfect shot for their records?" He looked at me, and then he reached across and gave my shoulder a small squeeze. "They'll miss what you do. People notice in time. It sticks." There is a small comfort in being seen, even late, but at the same time, there is an absolute in leaving when it is right for you. I had always measured my own life by the distance I could hold myself across difficult spaces. Going home felt like shrinking the world in a way that might be sweet. When the time came, I retired quietly. No fanfare beyond the small ceremony organized by the people who had mattered the most to me. Friends, a few officers, and the families who had been saved came to see me off. Someone carried my duffel to the truck. I looked back once at the base, where 100 small lights began to wink on as evening took the desert. The world had taught me a science of patience. It had taught me how to measure worth in breaths rather than headlines. Montana received me like a long-lost piece returning where it belonged. The town had not changed much. The line of cottonwoods still marked the river, the same barn still leaned at the corner, and my father's faded range notebook lay waiting on the kitchen table. I slept with the windows open to the sound of wind moving through pines, something that felt like a benediction. Life in Montana slowed me down in ways that did not feel like punishment. I learned again to watch the way light moves over grain and how patience can be a quiet companion for ordinary days. I taught local kids safety basics in a community workshop, sharing small practical lessons rather than weapons lore. It was healing work, not heroic, and it fit. Every so often, a message would come from someone at the base. A photograph of a recruit who'd gone on to a new posting, a short note that said thanks. Those gestures never demanded a reply, but I answered them anyway. We all keep the threads of community. Even when you leave, they pull at you. At the very end of my final summer, I walked out to the line where my father and I used to sit when I was a kid. The ridge was the same as it had always been, and the valley below had an old hush that felt like invitation. I set down a small folding chair, pulled out the Barrett for one last look, and breathed in the smell of the valley. I thought about all the lives I had touched and the ones that had touched me back. There are moments when you realize that the great acts do not always appear grand to the world. They sit in the quiet back rooms of memory, in notes tucked into pockets, in hands held at bedsides. I had once believed that visibility was everything. Now I know that visibility is only one way to measure meaning. If you took something from this story, consider sharing it with someone who understands the quiet work of courage. Subscribe to Military Revenge for other stories that honor lives lived in the narrow, brave places. The world, after all, needs witnesses to the small acts that keep us whole. When I finally folded the rifle and set it into my workshop for safekeeping, I did not feel empty. I felt completed in the ways that matter. The wounds remained and the memories carried their weight, but something lighter sat beside them, a steadiness, a knowledge that I had done what needed to be done, and that the silence I once hid in had finally taught others to listen. My father had written in his notebook. The last line in his precise, looping script reading patience is power. I traced the word power with a thumb and felt the truth of it. It had taken me a long time to understand what he meant. It had taken longer to accept that power could look like waiting, could sound like silence, and could be as fierce as a single bullet held steady for 8 seconds. That knowledge stayed with me, a simple talisman. It is the kind of story that does not seek recognition. It seeks continuity. It asks those who listen to remember, to pass along the notion that sometimes the greatest things are done so quietly that the world almost misses them. And if you remember one line from this account, let it be that patience transforms distance into certainty, and that courage can live quietly inside a steady pair of hands. They once saw me as the woman who cleaned rifles, the one too quiet to matter. What they never understood was that silence was never weakness, it was discipline. Every moment I spent alone in that armory, every breath I counted in the desert, was preparing me for the day when hesitation was not an option. I don't need them to remember my name. I only need to know that in the moment that mattered, I did what no one thought I could, that I stood between chaos and safety. And I held steady. The truth is, power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums softly beneath the sound of wind, waiting for the right second to speak. Real strength is quiet. It's in the patience to wait, the humility to listen, and the courage to act when it's time. Heroes don't always stand under spotlights. Many of them live in shadows, doing their duty with a calm so deep it looks invisible. But that kind of calm changes the world in ways noise never can. If this story touched something in you, leave a like, subscribe to Military Revenge, and share it with someone who believes in courage that doesn't need to be seen. Because sometimes the ones overlooked, the ones who wait in silence, are the strongest among us, and their stories deserve to be heard.